totally.
I love that you spoke about the intersectionality of it all. I guess when you are going into spaces of exploring what is anti-racism, just the language of it all was very complex, hence why the training was required. What does this actually mean? What does this actually look like? Who's actually enforcing it? Who's holding on to structure? Who's trying to move structure someplace else? The dynamics of the language was something that we really need to get our head around, so that way we were all communicating. There was actually a two-way engagement process, which really helps with that power dynamics. Having that, being able to do this in this safe place where there is cultural and psychological safety happening, really trickles down into the teams that, you know, the Western Sydney Community Forum supports as well, and then the stakeholders. So it's such a wonderful way to be able to do it in these safe spaces, so that way we can speak at our experiences.
Yes.
What was that like for you?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, no, thank you for bringing that up.
And I think it's important for us individually and important for us as a board, and it's also important because we're a peak body.
Yes.
And so we actually have influential power across Western Sydney to actually model and to actually bring about social change and dare I say it, social transformation through our modelling and actions and activities. And even when we get it wrong, to actually realise that we've got something wrong and to say that, to acknowledge that, to apologise is also modelling, I think, for the community.
There's challenges that we've got to issue and that we've got to look on internally as well. We don't have sufficient embedded First Nations representation on the board or in leadership positions to a sufficient degree, if at all in some areas with the forum. That's a deficit. It's a big deficit for us. I think that there are issues that have come to light for me internally because we deal in governance as a board.
Yes.
The other thing is we've got to call stuff out, and I do remember around the time that this work started, and it would have started without this backdrop, but you know, when we had lockdown occur in parts of Western Sydney, it was no coincidence that prejudice influenced some of the decisions around the communities that were treated the most harshly.
Yes.
And when you have a state minister, the Minister for Health, I won't name names, but certainly at the time I heard the words problem area attached to communities like Fairfield. That's, again, to go back to the notion of multiculturalism and cultural diversity as an asset. It's some of the most sophisticated communities that you will ever see, and the most generous, and to have them described that way, I think is an instance where the community forum is obligated, and not only just obligated, but willing to speak out, and that's something I take very seriously through the board, and we did so. And Billy was very active as well in drawing attention to all the incredible work that our members were doing on the ground when government were claiming themselves as quote-unquote first responders. They weren't first on the scene. It was the forum's members. It was community that responded. Government were rendering these communities as though they were in deficit. And I think the fact that we're able to say that's not the case, far from it, I think that to me was a moment of immense pride in what the forum does. And again, I was just the backseat guy, but it's really important that we draw that stuff up and say that's not true. In fact, it's the opposite. And that's been a really important moment, I think.
When you touch on that, Andy, I always think about the resilience of people from the Western Sydney. Like even when labelling comes at you, even when you have images of police and army around you, helicopters around me. Helicopters around me is my lived experience. Like 2:30 in Auburn, Chisholm Road, they were up there 2:30. I could put my clock on it. It demonstrates the resilience of the narration comes at you that's negative. The fact that the people go, you can keep throwing this at me, but we're resilient, we're connected, we're unified. And when you saw that 12 areas of concern that was labelled, local government heads, these mayors, during an election year, came together and said, no labelling, not okay. And I love that notion of what you said about calling it out, making sure it's authentic representation. And that's such a big issue around when we talk about anti-racism, around truth-telling, around narratives being hijacked, people of colour's work and intellectual property being extracted. These are all things that are a reality for so many people experiencing that. So the fact that you're calling it out is amazing.
I mean, I think there's a long way for us to go, and it is important we do that. And they did amazing work at the community level, our members. But I think I want to see a situation where the mainstream messaging through health is in language, reflective of the community to which it's targeted. So that the poor old guy speaking English, I want to be disadvantaged in those communities because I want to learn from those communities. So the idea that we attach multilingualism as a bolt-on to public messaging in those areas is completely wrong. It should be the headline message, and I think that's the kind of inversion that we want to see. I want to be the confused guy in the room. That's pretty easy. It's going to happen regardless. Yeah.
This is all going brilliantly, really fabulous, and so much good stuff. So I think we might just think about wrapping up. And I was thinking, imagine this is fast forward 5 years. Where would you like things to be in 5 years' time? So let's just think about wonder and what will still be here and what will have morphed in your ideal. And if you could just, so we can come in 5 years' time, I think, well, in 5 years, let me tell you, just if you get that 5 years in to start you off, then we can come in.
Billy, why don't you say?
Oh, yeah.
No pressure.
Great. I'm the timekeeper.
When I think about 5 years ahead and the future and this journey that we're on and what this journey might look like in 5 years' time, because we know the journeys won't end. We're not going to come to an end. It'd be great if we could sit around the table as an organisation and we have all our members and groups on that journey with us, and really having some momentum as a sector beyond our organisation, beyond our board, beyond our team, where we're on this journey together and really amplifying that as a critical public policy priority. And we're talking about how successful some of the strategies might have been over the last 5 years in terms of those practical outcomes around emphasising and language being front and centre, around having a governance structure that really facilitates and is founded on Indigenous and First Nations leadership. So these are the sorts of things that we'd love to be able to say in 5 years' time are a reality when we look back and also reflect on where we are in 5 years.
I agree. I think I want us to see, of course, the voice to Parliament realised. For our region, it's the largest urban population of First Nations Australians in the country. I think it's critical. I'd even like to see us then progressing work on a treaty, if that's what the First Nations leadership determine that they want. I think that's critically important. I think that the points around having language mainstreamed to parts of Western Sydney and to parts of Australia more broadly, where we actually foreground multilingualism and cultural diversity, not as an add-on, but as a fundamental characteristic of our region, in all sorts of messaging. I think that's really important. I'd love to see that occur. And it can occur within a 5 year time span, because I've seen how much attitudes towards Western Sydney and stereotypes have been altered radically in the space of 5 years. There was a time when you would walk into the room 5-10 years ago and not many people would own up to being from Western Sydney. Now it's one of the first things that you hear. What an incredible turnaround. But I want that for everybody and not just the usual voices. So in 5 years' time, I want to do myself out of the job and go and retire somewhere and learn and listen. And I want to see other more diverse voices in these roles, in leadership roles. And I want to get the hell out of there, because it's time for other people and other diverse voices to come to the foreground. But there's still work to do.
Yeah, and I think that there is that aspect in 5 years' time, and that's a sense of achievement. And I also think we'll still be doing the hard work. Because I think that all of us have some racism within us, as in a prejudice for a particular identity and gender, and which is kind of natural because that's kind of who we are. And I think we'll always be working on how we actually cross in our relationships and how we build understanding. And I think the forum it'll be important that in 5 years' time, I would be hoping that what the forum has done is it's got a lot of achievements, and it's also embedded this piece of work so that we're constantly working on anti-racism. Because it is a constancy for all of us the same, and it's also constant work because the community does change and the makeup changes. And I think, like I can think of, Auburn, for example, used to be all Anglo, and then it became Tongan, and now it's changed again. And I think communities change over a period of time. And so how do they actually deal with those changes and the succeeding groups of people who move into that area? That's an ongoing piece of work. So my hope is that we're still hard at it, and we've got some, and it's now become not an unusual thing. It's actually part of our daily work as a board and as an organisation.
I completely agree. I use the words intergenerational investment. I'm very aware that this is not going to be resolved even a little bit in 5 years' time. I completely am aware that we are navigating spaces that's not going to go straight, and I completely understand there's going to be some pushback, because that's what happens when you hit hard-hitting topics. We're not starting from a flat baseline. There's a lot of stories and truth-telling that needs to be resolved, and to be able to have safe space to unpack some of that. We talk about voice to parliament. That's going to be a really complex journey, and how do we make sure that First Nations people are supported in the best way possible, and how do I, as an individual, always stay behind and always listen and support the decisions that are made by elders. That's a massive priority for me.
Yeah.
But as we're going through these spaces, how do we make sure that we're also culturally and psychologically safe in that process? How do we make sure that resilience is building, because the issue is complex? And how do we make sure we keep in spaces of equity, inclusion, justice, those framings, to make sure that we've got the right equipment, the know-how, the people, the spaces. I'm confident we will get there. I'm very confident we will get there, because what's happened just in the last 2 years alone has gone leaps and bounds to what I was experiencing decades ago. So I can see that there is already movement, and there's already people coming on board. But the power of the ally, the accomplice, the co-conspirator, that's where the real power sits. Because again, people who have this power, how do you let go? How do you surrender? How do you trust? How do you discuss? How do you negotiate? Those things have to be worked out. And the only way to work it out is to listen and to hear and to understand. And for me, what's worked extremely well is keep it relational. And elders have taught me that, Elders have taught me that be patient, because sometimes the story I tell you today, you're not going to know for another 13 years. And that's happened to me. I remember having attended the local government Aboriginal network, and an elder gave me clapsticks. Someone who I didn't know handed me these beautiful clapsticks. I'm like, I'm not sure what to do with this. Am I allowed to use it? Like, all these concepts. And years later, elders would come and say, this is what you need to do, this is what happened. And years later, 13 years later, I know what to do with this clapstick now. Thank you so much, Uncle. But sometimes these stories aren't going to see the sunlight for a while. So to be patient and to keep it relational and to keep the respect and to honour when someone does something tiny or someone does something massive, they all matter. They all need to be respected, and they're treasures.
It's so that idea of being relational is fundamental, and to put the university professor hat on just for a moment, the biggest and the most accepted theories about identity, about how we constitute our sense of self, comes through our sense of difference. We don't achieve that through hanging out with people who talk, sound, look like us. You achieve real meaning and real depth in life, in your emotional relationships, your intellectual relationships, through profound difference. So it's actually it's incredible strength in terms of constituting your own trajectory through the world. And I think the notion that we think of difference as a foreign or oppositional thing is completely wrong. And we're in such a fortunate position personally and professionally to use difference in a really positive way as a source of learning, as a source of fulfilment. And how good is it that, in the forum, we get to live and breathe it every day and learn from it. And that's identity affirming.
Yeah.
And that's the journey that we've got to be on.
Yeah.
And it's affirmed through difference, not through all, being the same. And what a wonderful thing that is at its most intense in Western Sydney. So it gives us institutional identity as the forum as well, as individuals. So it's a great basis. You've got everything. You've got evidence, you've got emotionality, you've got relationships, and all of them suggest that diversity is the best asset you can have.
When I think about a really practical bar, about when I potentially see a shift in this country or in this state or in this community from a privileged decision-making perspective, if I can share a story. So when about 20 or 25 years ago, I went to a university in Dunedin in New Zealand.
Yeah.
And I was a university-educated professional. I was presenting at a conference, so I was in a position of privilege at that time. And I arrived on day one of this conference, and I sat in the conference room, and of course we've all done that many times. And for the first good hour of that conference, I had no idea what was going on. I could not understand the language. I had no idea. I knew nothing, and I just sat there. And it really was a really powerful moment for me, thinking about, as a person of privilege sitting here, I was not welcomed in my language, in a language that I understood, in a manner that I understood, or anything that I was used to in Australia. And it showed me how powerful that type of experience can be in terms of shaping the way that I see and that I respect traditional owners and First Nations. And not only that, it also showed me how far behind Australia as a nation is.
Yeah. We've had very poor leadership, I think, for quite a long time. And that can change.
Yeah.
In 5 years, a lot can happen to reanimate that.
So, hooray for all of you.
Done.
Up about power and relationships, so we didn't actually deliberately answer that question.
Yeah, all right.
How do we change?
So,
Does it mean that much?
is it, okay, let's do